Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Human Insights Unlocked. I'm your host Ishita, and today we have an extraordinary guest who will take us to the fascinating journey, the world of consumer behavior, behavioral economics, and the secrets behind successful pricing strategy. So, our guest today is none other than Melina Palmer, a renowned expert in behavioral economics and the CEO of the Brainy business. She's also the host of the popular podcast, as you can see her setup, the Brainy Business, Understanding the Psychology of Why People Buy, and author of the world award winning book, What Your Customers Want and Can't Tell You, and finalist of another book, What Your Employees Need and Can't Tell You. And she is also on to her next book, that is The Truth About Pricing, which is scheduled for the release in January 2024, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah.
Welcome to our show, Melina. I'm so happy and excited to have you today.
Oh, of course. Thanks so much for having me. Happy to be here as well.
Knowing you so far only want to makes me know more about you. Could you please take us through your journey so far?
Sure. Going back, I know often a question that people ask is like, how did you get into behavioral economics? Kind of what is it and how'd you find it? My undergrad is in marketing and business administration. And while I was working on that, there was a course where I had, one section of one book that was talking a little bit about buying psychology and why people do the things they do. And I thought it was just fascinating. And so I spent 10 years calling schools, asking about programs in it to go get a master's. And they said it wasn't a thing and it didn't exist and they didn't have a program for it. And so I, was working in industry and just always kind of had it back there. And at some point, I came across those from some people that were presenting. They're from the Center for Advanced Hindsight at Duke University. And they were talking about their research. And I realized that, oh my gosh, this is the thing I've been looking for, for a decade. And so found myself a master's program when they told me what it was actually called, behavioral economics, and knew that I was sort of early because I'd been looking for it for such a long time, especially on the applied side, though. There was like nothing in how you actually use this stuff in business. There's a lot more on the academic side. And so then I got introduced to someone who had a really popular podcast, and she nudged me to get that started. And mine was the first of its kind, really, in the world. And so anybody who was looking for behavioral economics podcasts would find the Brainy Business for the first year or so. And so that really helped it to take off, and that turned into books and teaching and more consulting and speaking and all the things.
I mean, I love the fact that how your interest strikes exactly what you when you wanted to study, and then you found the right thing at the right time, and that's how you just flew with it. So, can you also provide a concise overview of what behavioral economics is and why it's crucial for businesses seeking to understand consumer behavior?
Sure. Well, the reason that the field came about, and I like to say it's with, if you had traditional economics and psychology had a baby, we'd have behavioral economics. And the reason that we got this field is because traditional economics assumes logical people making rational choices in everything that they do all of the time. And not really the way it works. We're human and we know that, maybe we know that we should eat right and exercise, but we find ourselves binge watching Netflix while eating a whole bag of Cheetos or whatever it happens to be, right? And so,
Couldn't have been more
uh,
accurate.
I know,
Yeah.
right? And so with that, what you have is those models are predicting what someone says some people should do and not what they actually do. And what has happened is, over time, you had economists, psychologists, neuroscientists working together, entering into one another's fields to try and see, are there common threads in the brain that we can use to more accurately predict behavior, what actually will happen instead of the shoulds. And so by looking at this, the concepts that were found, and there are hundreds of them, are the underlying points of behavioral economics. And so what I do as an applied behavioral economist is helping people in business to understand, what it does, how you can communicate better to make it so that customers buy and employees buy in. And that's basically it.
Sure. So when you say it's a combination of both psychology and economics, right? So that's
Yep.
how behavioral economics would born. So how would you really say that you built in psychology? Is it also the study of science? Is it also study of neurology, the human behavior applied in the business strategies?
Yes. Hmm.
Sure. So if you would have to give an example of the same, what would be the most apt example to for a very beginner to understand the same?
Yeah. So there are, as you can appreciate, the field is now very, very vast, and what's really cool about it is you have people coming from all different backgrounds and angles to have come to this same sort of conclusion. And so, like I said, my background is in marketing, and I am much more interested on the psychology side. I went to a school of psychology to get my master's, and there are some that are really coming from the economics angle. You have a lot of people even that have become prominent in the field that have PhDs in architecture or in philosophy and all these other areas, like you said, neuroscience. And so depending on the angle you're coming from, you may be looking at different aspects.
Mhm.
So as I touched on a little bit, teaching. So I teach applied behavioral economics through the Human Behavior Lab at Texas A&M University, and that lab is the largest academic human behavior lab in the world. So we're able to do all sorts of tests, from eye tracking and galvanic skin response, EEG, and pupil dilation, and so many things when we're testing to see different aspects of something as simple as what people are looking at on the website and why they might be excited about that versus something else, and digging deeper than just a basic heat map. Um, so in that case, if you think about something like pupil dilation, and it's easy to say, so for one, to say your attention, you were looking at this thing, but like, was I looking at it because it was confusing, or was I looking at it for a long time because it was interesting, right? That's an important question, where just a heat map would say, whoa, everybody's looking at this, it's doing really well. You go, but is it because the text is hard to read? Is it because I'm
Hmm.
having a hard time understanding what's there? So it's not necessarily just good when you pick a singular data point like that. And so in the case of something like pupil dilation, we'd say you must be interested because your pupils have dilated. But knowing also distance from the screen is important, because if I got closer to the screen while my pupils dilated, then I probably am interested and I'm leaning in. Whereas if I went back, it could be that something kind of jumped out at me or was confusing. And so I had this like fear response. And so that distance is important when we're looking at the behavior to understand what maybe was happening at the same time. And so at the lab, we can be combining all these different aspects, and in some studies have been able to accurately predict whether someone was going to buy without even talking about the price or anything like that, or asking them, hey, do you want to buy this thing? We're able to predict it with over 80% accuracy without even asking the question, when you understand what's happening in the brain.
That is super interesting. I'm only able to think right now that there are so many layers to it. The more you get to know, the more you want to know, and it doesn't restrict to just one concept of it, and not
Right.
just click rate, not just heat map, but the entire overall human behavior and every aspect that it can influence the business. That's amazing. What are some of the effective behavioral nudges and persuasion techniques that you think that businesses can use to influence consumers based on every research and every lab experience that you might have come across?
Sure. Well, we'll first take a step back. I always really like to explain how our brains really work, because even though we all have them, we don't really know what's going on in there. And so, one of the best analogies, metaphors, that I've heard of for this is to think about your brain like a person riding an elephant. And in this case, and this was recommended by Jonathan Haidt, is if you think about that, you have your logical conscious rider, has a plan, knows where it wants to go, it's ready, it can see on the horizon, best path, excited, got this down, right? But the elephant, maybe it doesn't want to go that way. Maybe it wants to go faster or slower. It wants to just sit down. And you can't push or pull or logic the elephant into doing what you want it to do because it's really big, a lot bigger than you, and it doesn't speak the same language. It's the same with the conscious and the subconscious brain. They don't talk to each other, and then the subconscious is doing a lot more than we realize. And so when we think about our behavior, we like to think that we're, in control of everything that we're doing all the time, and we're running that conscious show, and that the writer is us. And we don't really think about this elephant piece. But in reality, we kind of just forget that we're elephants all the time, and that when we're selling, we're also selling to elephants, right? So you need to understand what's going to be motivating and going to drive the behavior of the elephant, how it makes decisions, becoming like an elephant whisperer in that way. And so when we know that, then those concepts of behavioral economics and behavioral science are the decisions really more that that elephant is using to make its decisions. And when we think about the sheer volume, so for, our listeners here, if you think to, how many decisions do you make on an average day? If you're going to just make a guess, if we think about it.
I mean, I can't. I wouldn't.
I know. So, when I'm doing this as, from a stage or whatever, I always like to ask, and you get people shouting out a whole range, and often people feel like they need to exaggerate, kind of like you're saying, like, I know why you're asking, so it must be much higher than I think, right? So I'm going to say like 5,000 or something, I get that. And actually, research shows that we all make an average of 35,000 decisions every single day, all of
Wow.
us. It's a lot that's going on, right? And
Hmm.
and then I always like to ask, how many decisions now do you remember making yesterday? Even if you guessed, 5,000 people, and then someone always says like 2 or 10, right? We just don't really process them in the
Ah,
same way. And so we couldn't survive if we were having to consciously make all of those decisions. So it's a really good thing that our brains work this way. But the way it's done is that subconscious is making really quick, automatic decisions based on rules of thumb, predictability, habits of things that have worked well in the past. So every decision that you're really making is based on what has worked well before, and not necessarily what's the perfect solution for the exact thing that's in front of you right now. And most of the time, this serves us really well. But sometimes it's kind of funky, right? And it's not quite what we would want it to be. So in this case, humans are really loss averse. We don't like to give up things. And so that impacts the decisions we make based on if you framing is a concept in behavioral science as well. How you say the thing makes a difference of whether
hmm.
someone is excited about it or they hate it, even if it's exactly the same thing. We are also really impacted because we're a herding species. So when we see star reviews or
Hmm.
ratings, those sorts of things, and hearing like most people like this, like those people could be nothing like you, but it feels better to make that decision because we heard, by nature. So many of these aspects are how we're making decisions all the time. And again, so much of it is happening on that subconscious level. And so when we sit down and decide to create our pricing plan, or we're going to make our advertising message, or we're thinking about what everyone should want, we are thinking we're communicating to how we think we would want to buy if we were in that scenario, and just completely forget about our elephantness. And
Hmm.
that's where we can, because you sit down, you go, okay, what would you do if this was me? How would I do
Hmm.
this? Let me really sit and think about it. So when you do that, right, like, let me think about what I do and why I do it, absolutely not looking at that subconscious space. That's all conscious writer aspect. And so having some rules that you can look to be testing and applying and saying, hey, like, we know herding is a thing. Like, maybe we put in something to say that, 4 out of 5 dentists recommend this toothpaste. or we want to look at some, and like that's an authority bias thing too, or to say 99% of people buy from us again, right? Or whatever. Showcasing those aspects are those little nudges that, like, so like I said, this is a very long answer to get to your question about nudging. And
Mm-hmm.
that's behavioral economics and behavioral science is built on this idea of little nudges that can influence a decision that someone is going to make. And in behavioral economics, the person who's making the choice always has free will, and there's no like, you have to do this. If you put in a rule in a way that is a forced choice, that's really getting outside of behavioral science. And that helps to address, I know there are always questions about ethics and things like that.
Right.
So when we present information, whether you think about it in advance or not, you are influencing the choice that someone is going to make because the way you presented the information is impacting their decision. And so I say, always better to be thoughtful about it and to help nudge for better behavior in what we think will be the best choice for someone in that moment. And, we just hope, as with everything, that we have way, 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 way more good, ethical people than bad ones
Of course.
in the
Uh,
world in general. Yeah.
Definitely. But I'm just still curious, like there are two takeaways which I understand from this entire conversation. One is that learning from the past and see what's working, what's not working for you, and focus more on what's working. And the second aspect, which I understand, is focusing on the content bit, thinking from the consumer's end, not what you want.
Mm.
This usually is something that brands try to go by the book, but still breaking through that clutter still becomes a little hard, right? Because the entire competitive landscape is huge,
Mhm.
and the overall attention span of the regular viewer is also decreasing further. So, would you still say that it's just the content game that brands need to like keep up at, or are there any specific strategies or still techniques? Just again, getting one layer deep into it as to on the how bit of it, uh,
Yeah,
just to be more precise on the
sure.
takeaway.
Yeah. So in a space where, like I said, there are hundreds of concepts being impacting decisions from many angles all of the time, it would be great if it was to say, you always just focus on this one thing and that'll do it.
Hmm.
Um, and that's not the world that we live in. However, we do have many of these, again, concepts that we're able to lean into, and it is content, but it's more than that because it's understanding deeper to what's driving the behavior, right? So if you think about a test that may be done by, we'll say, like a grocery store, and so let's say you're curious about how people are going to be buying in the grocery store,
Hmm.
and maybe you sell chocolate bars. So you are, or you're looking to promote the sale of chocolate bars, right? And so, you know, at some point you think, oh, we'll do a focus group and we'll ask people what they think about chocolate bars, or we're going to do a survey and ask them if they would want to buy chocolate if we did X, Y, or Z. Like, hey, if we added peanuts, would you want them? Or if we said it was now in sustainable packaging, would you be interested in that? And people say, yeah, I care about that. But we know, like, that doesn't often translate to real buying behavior. And so the question would be why, right? So you say, like, is everyone just lying to us? Why would they do that, right? So, no, typically people aren't lying to you, but it's, they don't really know what they're going to do, and they don't know what's driving those decisions. And so asking them what they would do, or even why they would do something, or why they've done something in the past when they're in a totally different mental space, is not really predictive of the behavior. So taking a step back, then, you have some grocery stores, and larger chains that have started, they've built full physical stores that are only for testing, and you can kind of see and observe behavior when people are coming in and shopping, and what do they look at. You can test different things, and of course you have virtual reality options for this sort of stuff right now as well. So that's great, right? That's a step in. You get to watch where they actually go. And we want to think about, so for everyone who has children, let's talk about how you got small kids, right? I personally have 3 kids, 10 and under, one of them who's only 2. And you think about going into the grocery store. And if I was part of an experiment and they were say, hey, just go about your typical day. But I've come to a place where I don't have my children with me and I'm just able to leisurely walk through the store in a way that I absolutely would not be able to do if they were there with me. Maybe I ate before in a way that I'm like running in between stuff and I'm shopping hungry in real world, and I have less time than I would when I'm here. I have a lot of extra time. I'm not in the right mind space for the types of decisions I'm going to be making when I've got kids distracting me, when I'm hungry, when I'm in these different spaces. And so then understanding if you're testing something on the packaging or the signage that may or may not capture my attention, or if you say, hey, look at this sign, do you see that? Right. It's totally different than what will happen in that moment. And so understanding when I'm under time pressure, how I would be acting differently, when I'm distracted, when I'm hungry, the door that I come into, the way that I would be, where I'm looking, if I've got my kids, I'm looking more down than I would be up at different things, right? So all of that is really important in understanding the experience that someone is having, and then thinking about how you want to be communicating to them in that moment in the way that they're feeling. And you can't do this for everyone and have a really blanket approach. This is why, it really brings this scientific logic to the thing that marketers and whomever have been saying forever, of like, you can't, if you're marketing to everyone, you're marketing to no one.
No.
It's the, and when you're too generic, when it's too just sort of out there, it's not resonating with people. And a big piece is because you have to understand how that brain is working in that moment. And then taking it even a step further to the chocolate bar example, which I used specifically, and I've talked about on my podcast when I did some work for Mars, um, that, question of chocolate is it the same everywhere in the store when you're buying a chocolate bar? And of course the answer is no, right? So the chocolate bars at the checkout are different than the ones in the aisle, which is different than something on the end cap, which is different than when you walk in, which is different than, if there was something on your way out, right? Like all those little aspects make a difference in your buying behavior. And if you're not thoughtful to where it was placed and what was before it and why and what else I've done, it can take you in a totally different direction. So context is so important to behavior, and understanding what you're trying to drive and where people are coming from matters then in the way that you will communicate to them. So like ultimately it sort of comes to clear content, but it's not just about being clear, right? Because clear to what? What do you want them to do? Where are they now? What's keeping them from doing that? Why haven't they done it in the past? What's the habit? Are you trying to break it, or are you the habit because you're the market leader? These are all really critical questions that you have to be answering before you then think about what behavioral levers you want to pull.
All right, thank you so much. Um, so let's take an example that a business want to do a product launch. We can pick any example that you like. During the product launch, are there any set advanced models or frameworks that businesses can utilize to gain deeper understanding of the consumer behavior while doing that launch?
Yeah. So the first thing would be just doing a deeper dive into understanding some basic concepts. And while it doesn't have to come from my book or books, in What Your Customer Wants and Can't Tell You, I do have, I've picked 16 concepts specifically, instead of saying like there are hundreds of these, right? That are ones you can get kind of a mini course in and have some experience and understand, the background behind framing and anchoring and loss aversion, um, to then kind of know how they work on their own, so you can think about how to bring them together. And so in my book, I have a framework that I've set up that is to think about it in a way that I call behavioral baking. And so when you think about, if you were going to go start a bakery, but you've never baked anything in your whole life, but you feel like you're able to tackle this thing. The first thing you would probably want to do is learn about each of the ingredients on their own, like what they do and how they work, because flour, sugar, butter, and eggs can be combined in all sorts of different ways to make all sorts of things. But if you don't know what each one does on its own, you may end up with a real mess if you try to put in like 3 cups of sugar and a tablespoon of flour and think it's going to be a cake on the other side, right? So you want to know what those ingredients are. Then you need to know what it is you're trying to make, because like I said, they can combine in all sorts of ways. And so if you decide you're going to make a cake, we'll just say, then you're probably also not going to say, hey, I've eaten a lot of cake, I bet I can figure this out, right? Because that's ridiculous. No one would ever do that.
Yeah.
You're going to go to a recipe to figure out what you should be making, how to do it, because people have done this before. And that first time, you're probably going to go as simple as possible to say like a box cake mix where you're least likely to make mistakes. And it still might not be perfect when you make, that first cake might be soupy or a little bit dense, or maybe it's burnt, but you wouldn't say, hey, like I tried baking once and my cake didn't come out. Baking's not real. It's not a thing. It doesn't work. Because again, that's silly. But we say things like that in business all the time, right? We tried Instagram once and we didn't go viral. That's not a real strategy or whatever. And so to instead think about this as if you're going to be a professional baker, you're doing lots of tests and trials and tidbits and tweaks and little things and going to learn about why didn't this do this way and what happened. You become very curious about all the nuance and the aspects of what's happening. And so if we bring this back to behavioral economics, would be very much the same. The concepts are your ingredients. You have the recipe for, you need to know what you want people to do and then the recipe to get there. I have one in the book that people can follow. But how you go about applying and testing, you don't want to do everything all at once and be throwing in all the things and just sort of see what happens, or even looking and say, this study said that someone did this, so we're going to copy it exactly and we'll get exactly the same results, because it doesn't work that way. Fortunately or unfortunately, like I said, context is really important, but having the thoughtfulness of where people are now, where you want them to go, what's keeping them from doing the thing you think they should be doing, and what are the most likely behavioral levers you can be pulling to help nudge them to make that other decision. That really is the framework of behavioral baking, at least, and what I talk about in my book.
Sure, sure. And would that differ with small scale enterprise to small scale to large scale enterprise, or to a product or a service company, or the concept would still be the same?
Yeah, it's effectively the same, and it's intentionally vague in that way that it can be applied really across anything that you're doing or working on. And
Sure.
so, like you said, in thinking about a product launch, right, part of a question you asked. So I have an example from a financial institution here in the States. I was doing that I got brought in to help on a project years ago. And they were launching a new checking account that they were really excited about. It was a rewards checking that paid, when you save your money there, you get a high interest rate. And they just wanted some support on the marketing messaging in this case. And they already had the product built. And it was just making sure that they were in a good spot, really, is what they thought when they brought me in. But what they were planning to have on all their billboards and everything and all their messaging, headline being, earn up to 1.26% APY on up to $25,000 in balances. Ta-da, right?
I'll buy. I'll just buy
It
like that.
just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? It's this ridiculous, right? And nobody is motivated by that. Even if you know the math, even if you know it's a good rate, it's just not like, ooh, right? It's not an exciting
Right.
message.
Yeah.
And, if you think, so this financial institution was in Southern California, LA area, as people are going like a zillion down the freeway, like that's not turning heads, right? And so in the concept of framing, which I touched on a little bit, which is, how you say something matters more than what you're
Mhm.
saying. And so I got them to reframe, thankfully, and not have that be the headline. And instead, we went with, did your checking account pay you $315 last year?
Nice. Very
Right.
well.
So it's a very simple, the 315 is the 1.26 by the 25,000, but it actually means something now to me. And I can very quickly say either yes, it did, or more likely no. And hey, who's talking about that? I'm curious to go learn more now about it. And our brains react differently to questions than they do to statements as well.
Mm.
So including more questions, especially toward the end, whether it's an email or anything, is really impactful on behavior. And so in this case, it's a slight reframe. And in the case of this financial institution, they didn't change any of where they were placing their media. They didn't change the investment. And they had an increase of 60% in their month over month account openings when launching that campaign. And so the slight change in wording that's really behavioral economics is all about, I'm always looking for what's the smallest change that can have the biggest impact, right? What's the
Mm.
easiest thing we can do that's going to tweak the behavior and make it to where something just feels different than it might otherwise. So, we also are impacted by numbers in a really interesting way. And this is a concept known as anchoring. And when you think about, if you go into a grocery store and say they had a sale on cans of soup, and it was just, all these cans of soup are just 40 cents or something, right? You're like, whoa, cool. I'm going to stock up on soup, right? And when it says that they have the cans of soup and it says limit 12, people will
Mm.
buy more than if it was unlimited. So that is
Absolutely.
interesting, right? So when I could have bought 100, I bought less than when you told me there was a limit on how many I could get. And like, why? Like, again, logically, it doesn't make sense. And yet, because you're a human person, you can absolutely see why you would do that, right? Like, during the pandemic here in the States, and I know they did this in other areas of the world too, but when they decided to do a limit on meat that you could buy. So at the store, you could only buy 3 items of meat when you would go. And I saw that and said, like, it's going to be sold out everywhere. No question. Because even if you were only intending to buy one, you're absolutely buying 3. And it's not because of you, it's because all those other people might make weird choices and I want to make sure I'm stocked up, right? And that it's a herding instinct. The number made it so people feel like, well, everybody else must be buying more than me. I need to get more. And we already feel a lack of control. And so we're feeling like we need to
Right.
go buy all the toilet paper, right? Those sorts of things. So again, that limit, that number makes a difference. The framing of how you talk about it, the mind state that someone is in when they're looking in that experience is very different, in different moments. It all comes into play. And you just have to be thoughtful about all of those things that you think shouldn't matter because they really, really do.
Now it just me. I started off with thinking that behavioral economics is such a crucial part for every content creator. Then now I'm at that it's crucial for every department to every
Mm.
individual,
Right.
because if you're a sales team, you're talking to a client. If you're a customer experience or giving an experience, that is
Hmm.
something that you truly need to understand from top to bottom. Wow.
Right, right. Well,
And
and just even human resources, right? So, like I said, so my second book is What Your Employees Need and Can't Tell You. So, thinking about how we present changes to peers at work. If you're asking
um,
for a increase in budget, if you're trying to get people to buy in on whatever idea you're selling them for a change initiative, if people don't like it, and you have a tendency over and over again that you have a great idea, but people just aren't buying in, you could be framing it wrong, right? And so a simple tweak in the way that you communicate it can have all the difference. The ideas we present, it's not about the idea, it's about how you talk about it.
I love it. Love it. All right. Um, So, though I understand the overall concept now much more deeply, and especially understanding that customer mind is like an elephant, but are there any set common biases that you have encountered in customer decision making from the customer's point of view now?
Well, yes, there are lots and lots of that's all of kind of what the field is built upon. So I've talked a little bit about framing. I talked a little bit about anchoring, and we talked a little bit about the nudging. So when we think about, I'm trying to determine if there's a best next one that I would want to jump in on to think about that buying behavior. Do you have a specific kind of example that you had in mind or scenario where you feel like we haven't touched on yet?
Um, all right. No specific example from my end though, but say if as a consumer, I'm more inclined towards buying an iPhone, and at the same time, I'm also I know that say Samsung is a good competitor and probably surpasses in every feature from iPhone. But I already have a bias towards an iPhone. So I would
Hmm.
just go for it.
Yeah.
So say brand like Samsung now how would that probably try to mitigate those biases?
Mm.
I think that is one
Yeah.
example that strikes my mind.
Sure. Yeah. So, as an avid iPhone user, I disagree with your statement that right,
Sure.
which of course proves the point. As I sit
Love
with my
it.
iPad and my Mac and my Apple Watch, like
I
I'm
think this is a perfect example in that case.
yeah. So with this, it is important to know, what it is that so the thing again, it's often not logical why someone is picking something, and what in the way we've always done things. But when we look at, you can't try to talk about everything that you're doing and be beating on just things that you think someone should care about. So often the messaging that comes out is like, we have higher processing power. We've got whatever, right? There's more storage or something. And it's like, well, it's not about that. For anyone who's an Apple person, Apple is part of your identity. It's who you are as an like an iPhone user, right? It says something about you, and it comes to our, again, herding tribal nature of who we are. We also, we shift through different identities throughout the day. We're constantly kind of fluctuating. And so knowing that brands influence who we are and how we relate to people. So, like, if I see another person with an iPhone, it's like we've got something in common already. And I know some things about you similarly to other moms, to other podcasters, to other people that drive Volvo or whatever, right? Like you have something in common. And it's a real core piece of who you are as a person. And so if you think that the buying behavior, even like Starbucks, right? I like Starbucks, and it's not about coffee, right?
See,
And yeah, and it's deeper than experience. So the thing for brands to know is that brands are memories. So when you think about your favorite brands, iPhone or Apple, Disney, Starbucks, anything else, and you say it's your favorite one, like this one's my favorite, but really, why? Like, why did you say they were your favorite? How much of it is just habit that they've become a part of who you are? And what would they need to do to where it would be problematic? And you think about first interactions, think about it like a first date, right? So you're going on a date with someone, you've been set up on a blind date, and you're there and you are incredibly critical of every single thing that that person is doing and trying to sort them into the bucket of, a hero or a zero, right? You are very, very little things could have a huge impact. And if this person like slurps their soup in a really weird way, maybe like, well, I can't live with that forever. I'm out, right? And otherwise they were perfect, but that one little thing was enough to say like, no, I'm done, right? Where today, if my husband was to slurp his soup in the same way, I'm not like filing for divorce, right? That would be, again, ridiculous, right? And it's the same when we think about interacting with brands. And when in those first moments, we're really critical and looking for things that are where we're gonna be out, right? To prove it's not worth it or it's not good, especially if we already have something really good, right? I'm married to my iPhone and we're in a great relationship that we've been in for a really long time. And you're trying to sway me. You're trying to like lure me away from the love of my life in this case, right? If we think about it in that way, you're not coming in and being like, well, like, let me tell you about all my features. Like, I don't care. It's not about that, right? It needs to be much more like targeted and little things, and finding, are there other people, let's say, who I really admire who use your product that I may not know about. So, this is where influencers could come in. So we'll just use Kardashians as an example because we all talk about, keeping up with them, things like that. So if all of a sudden, the Kardashians are all like, gross, we hate iPhones, like we're out and we only use Samsung because of some random reason, but like it's because it's our thing, they put our brand on it, maybe. Or you do those, collaboration with something else that I really love. Then you go, oh, well, maybe like if this person who I want to be like, who's more central to my identity, does this thing, I want to be like them, I'm going to step in. That's like one way that you can be looking at this. But again, it's not about talking about your features in one more way that's really convincing. It's about looking at the bigger picture. And it's not all about that herding piece, right? Or influencers. But that's one path.
Sure. I think I take a lot from this. There's, of course, no one set, but I think the biggest takeaway word for me was the memory.
Oh,
Because I really do think that, when you create a great memory with a product or brand or event for that matter,
mm-hmm.
anything not physical as well, that's something that really it's stuck in your mind forever. And that's what you want to go back to again and again and again.
Right.
So I
Yeah.
think that's
That's
how.
why consistency is so important in your messaging as well. And where we're talking
Mhm.
about, bringing it back around to knowing who you're talking to and what matters to them and what your brand stands for. And you can't be talking about everything you do all of the time. One of my favorite examples of this is, and I don't know how, I believe this is a pretty internationally reaching example, but you never know with ads and things in different areas. But so we have State Farm insurance here and lots of insurance agencies. And the thing that we get is where there's the example, they had a commercial that the husband is on the phone late at night and like kind of talking in hushed tones, and the wife comes downstairs and turns on the light and says, "Who are you talking to?" Right? And he says, "It's Jake from State Farm." He says, "At 3 a.m, who is this?" And he's like, "Jake from State Farm." And she says, "What are you wearing?" "Jake from State Farm." He says, "Khakis," right? Like ridiculous, right? And everybody, like people went as Jake from State Farm for Halloween and that sort of deal when that first came out a million years ago. But people remember that commercial, and Jake from State Farm is a thing, right? But
Mhm.
when we think about all the things and how many times an insurance company might say 24/7 phone service,
Mhm.
bleh, right? Who cares? It doesn't mean anything to
Mhm.
me. Knowing that when I'm up at 3 o'clock in the morning and I can't sleep and I had a question about my insurance, I can call and there's somebody there. And it's not just somebody, it's Jake. Jake's so nice and he's there. He's waiting for me, right? That's a need that I have. And every single insurance agency, maybe there are some that don't, but the big ones, they all have 24/7 call centers, right? Someone is there to help all the time. But they made that really tangible in a way that resonates. And it's focusing on one tiny, 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 tiny aspect of what they do. And everyone else does it. But they made it so it became a real benefit that spoke to the mindset of that consumer in a way that you may want to change because like that somebody's there, it resonates differently. And if they had that as a long list of all the stuff we do, it would just blend into the background, right? So really thinking about why, who cares? Why does this matter to someone? And really focusing in on the small story, thinking back to those 35,000 decisions that I was talking about that people make every single day. That goes to show we often think about things way too big. We think like, I'm going to get them from A to double Z in a moment, but really life is built up of micro moments. It's those tiny, tiny moments of decision. And we're like nudging you along at all these little points. And those who are more thoughtful about those tiny, tiny micro moments are more successful. And you're thinking about how they build the story, the memory of your brand again and again, consistently of who you are. And they're either working together or it's just a big mess and I don't really remember or know what you're about.
Sure. Though we're already past, almost close to our end of the podcast, but I have a lot of questions remaining. But I'm still stuck to this one because me being from the creative background, I kind of understand that, um, that we do want to be creative, and then we do want to, uh, you know, um, just whatever that you're explaining, that we want to hit the right spot and talk about those tiny moments, trying to convert that tiny pain point into humor that sticks along with the customer for a long time. But then of course, like there are a lot of blockages, and that's something that, because being in an advertising agency in the past, I've hung around with a lot of folks where this used to be a day-to-day task, but still, like, there is no set process which I feel that there is developed to get into that right content set. So while understanding the fact that the content has to be created for the customer, but are there any, like, step by step ladder that you can climb to get to that right content fit, or it's just the research, it's just understanding, listing down the entire pain points of the customer, and then thinking about how can you work around your boring content into fun, creative, or you know
Sure. Yeah. And it doesn't always have to be fun. So that's, sorry to put another like layer of, like humor is really hard to do. Right. So, a couple models, for people to take a look at, would be, so there's another that's called COM-B, which is you look at the capability, opportunity, and motivation, and all three of them being necessary to change a behavior, right? So, does the person have the capability to do the thing we want them to? Do they have the opportunity? And are they motivated enough? That is one aspect to be able to look at. So that that's a model that is one that's pretty easily accepted as available.
what's it called again?
COM-B, COM. So for everyone who wants to look at COM-B, that is a good model. Another is called the EAST framework, which is to look to make it so that your communication is easy, attractive, social, and timely. And with that, also then Cass Sunstein, who is a laureate that's done really amazing work, and co-wrote the book Nudge, with Nobel laureate Richard Thaler. He suggests also to have it be a feast model, that you look for that fun aspect, making it fun. So that would be fun, easy, attractive, social, and timely. So those are things you can be asking. And it's not, I have my students ask often, things like, well, which one is best, or which one do I start with? How does this work? And really, they are all important. I've always kind of joked as like, I need a mug or a shirt or something that says it depends, because because
Oh
I say
wow.
it too often. But with that, I always say that if there's something that really resonates with you, right, that you hear it, whether it's my behavioral baking aspect, whether it is the East or Feast, or COM-B, if you heard it and you're like, yeah, I can do that, you go do some research and feel really good about it. And maybe the other one, you're like, I don't even like, where would I start? I'm not sure. Just pick one, and start using it for a while, and then you can gain comfort. And it's the same where I talk about the recipes. Really, this is in that behavioral baking aspect. Like if you look at that box cake mix, that's kind of what these are. And then eventually, as you gain some comfort, maybe you throw in some of your own ingredients, or you start to make things from scratch. You get a little bit more knowledge, and you feel like you can see like something's missing. I want to try this little extra thing. I want to throw this little bit in there. It would be the same with any of these models, right? So you start with one, you use it enough to see how it works for you, and maybe where you're naturally incorporating something new, or you're finding there's a gap for the work that you're doing, and you can modify it from there.
Sure, that helps. No, I think great one. Though I'm going to
Yeah.
definitely research a bit more about it and would love to buy more books on this. Yeah, no, too
Yeah.
interested.
Mhm.
Now, I know that we're extending way too much, but I'll just quickly. I want to also, since you've also written the book on pricing, I cannot not capture that area in the podcast today. So, of course, pricing is a critical aspect of consumer behavior. So, what are some of the psychological factors that come into play when consumers assess the value of the product or service?
Sure. So the thing about pricing, the truth about it, and in the book, which, like we said, is coming out, at least here in the States, January of 2024, it's, in the first 4 pages, I say, like, here's the actual truth about pricing, but like, don't worry, there's a whole book about why this matters. But like, price isn't about the price, just which shouldn't really be much of a surprise based on some of what I've been talking about. It looks like maybe it is. But so we don't really buy about because of the price. And when, even though, and I know people are like yelling at me as you're listening now, whether in your head or actually out loud,
In my head,
that
I'm just okay. I'll let you
like,
complete.
I know. You're like, "Nuh-uh," right? I've had people tell me they're picking something else because of the price. Like, I price shop all the time, right? So it comes to price when you haven't implemented all these other aspects of behavioral science properly,
Hmm.
because people don't have anything else to make a decision on. So it doesn't have to be about that. But when we think again about the elephant and the writer, the elephant is making the decision, and then the writers feel like having to justify what's wrong. And the thing I can say is like, it just feels expensive. But like, what's the thing you've bought that was totally ridiculous and definitely expensive, and something that you don't usually get? Or, oh, I never do this, but I couldn't not get that little thing, right? Like,
Hmm.
but what is it about that thing that made you feel like it was the thing that was worth the exception? And as you start to think about it, it's like, well, I mean, it was this, but I've done that here too. And oh, there's this other thing. And why do I care about my iPhone? And why do I drive the car that I drive? Why do I buy that Starbucks every day? Why do I invest in this hobby? Like, my office is full of Lego. I love Lego and doing them. But I don't ever buy them for myself. They're gifts from my husband. So when we think about buying a gift, is very different than, even though it's like we have combined finances. So it's like I bought it for me, but I don't feel like I can, right? Like all these little rules. So in pricing strategy, I talk about, my framework there is called "It's Not About the Cookie." And so, in that not about the price. So just the story here being, imagine we're walking down the street having a great conversation, and all of a sudden there's this like amazing scent that comes down the street, and it's like sweet and a hint of salt, and it's chocolatey, and we can tell it's chocolate chip cookies are baking, right? And we're still talking, but we're a little bit distracted now, as it's like, our noses are pulling us down the street like we're cartoon characters trying to find the source of the scent. And then we get in front of the store and we see there's a line, and then we sort of find ourselves in the line, and they say, oh, like, for today only, it's buy 3 get 1 free, and we've got these free samples. And like, before we know it, we are walking out of the store eating cookies and with a bag in hand with an undisclosed number in there, right?
Hmm.
So if we take a step back now, so that's like scenario 1. Scenario 2, we're walking down the street, same conversation, same street, same everything. Someone comes up, shoves a coupon in our faces and says, hey, 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 today only, we're selling these cookies, and if you buy 4, you only pay for 3 of them, and I've got samples. So, ugh, this guy, like, get out of here, right? We were having a good conversation. How rude are you? Now we're talking about bad sales experiences, and we get in front of the store. We see the line, and we're like pitying them for having such low standards. And then we smell the
Mm,
cookies, and it's the incentive to go write a Yelp review about how terrible they are and that we would never buy cookies from them. So, in those 2 scenarios, one, it could have been exactly the same cookies, and
mm,
it didn't matter, right?
mm,
Because it wasn't about the cookie,
mm,
but it also wasn't about the price, right? Those first cookies could have been $2 a piece. Maybe they were 50 cents a piece in the other. And we're almost definitely buying in the first scenario. We're almost definitely not in the
mm,
second scenario. And what's really interesting is all the same things happened. They just happened in a different order in this case, right? So being pulled in by that scent of the cookies is always really important to be, and this is a concept of priming, that it's setting the stage, it's influencing that behavior of getting that subconscious brain excited, and the senses are a really key way. It's not just about reading something, but smells and sounds can be very impactful on decision making. Also, if you can touch something and you can feel how soft it is, we want it more than we would have if we didn't have that example. This is why we like unboxing videos and all of these pieces of experience. And so when we get to feel like we're part of it and we're excited and that subconscious wants it, it's a very different experience. And the writer can justify why we needed the thing this time when we know that it's not about the price and the experience is set up in a
mm.
way to help.
Sure. Um, just again, adding one more scenario to it. Say it's a digital product and it's a
Mhm.
digital service.
Yep.
And now there are players in the same industry.
Yeah,
Now, how would you probably influence the psychology of pricing?
for sure. So it's the same concepts all apply. And the thing that you're giving away, your scent of the cookies, is your those lead magnets, the loss leaders, the way you're communicating and showing up on social media, the way that you're helping other people. So, like looking at something like the Brainy Business podcast, right? Like that takes me a lot, lot of time. And from at the beginning, it was all a solo show. So no guests. I'm just doing research and talking about a concept for an hour. So like there's a whole episode on framing that's like an hour long. Um, and it's got tons of citations and stuff in it. And those were taking me, 8, 10 hours a week to do those episodes for people. There's a lot that goes into
Wow.
them. And it's totally free for everyone to go and find and get, that knowledge. And it's something that I'm sharing. And I make lots of worksheets to help people to get the information and everything. And it helps people to understand what behavioral economics even is. That another concept in this framework is of reciprocity and the importance of giving and knowing that we humans are inclined to give back when people give to us. So this is why giving a lead magnet or
Hmm.
the little bits of information, those aspects of thought leadership, thinking about others before yourself, commenting on someone's social post, sure. But what if you share and tag other people? What if you're like being way, way generous and just being a good human out in the world? When people are then ready to buy, like think about can you think and name someone who has just liked a post of yours? Like maybe, right? I don't know. Like, can we remember the people who regularly comment on our posts? Some of them. Someone who went and wrote a post and is like, OMG, like I read Melina's book and it was so good, or Melina did this and I just saw this person and like you should totally check out her stuff. Like you remember those people,
Hmm.
right? And when it's time that you need the thing that they sell, or you talk to somebody who needs what they sell, you're gonna be saying, "Oh, like behavioral economics, you need Melina. Don't even go anywhere else," right?
Hmm.
And that brings in that social proof aspect,
Hmm.
again because of that herding, and it builds that network for you, and it's making it so you're not shouting and throwing coupons in people's faces. That thoughtfulness to giving first and being really, really generous and helping others, knowing that it's don't do it just because you think you're going to get something out of it, because people can sense that too. But like really just having, that more abundance mindset and giving generously and knowing like the universe will take care of it. And for everyone who thinks I'm being ridiculous, that's fine. But there's a lot of science behind it as well. So that's really the easiest way that I recommend
I
going
mean,
about this
I
in a
had
service-based business.
I had so many follow-up questions on pricing front, but I think all of them are just dissolved now because I wanted to understand the importance of price anchoring, the entire competitive edge in pricing, and now I'm just like, okay, the rest of it will fill it up. So yeah, I think
Well,
the
there's a
price
whole
will take
book.
care
It's
of
coming.
itself.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. That's, if you know who, again, it's all the same stuff I've been talking about of who are you communicating with? What do they care about? What's the problem that you're solving for them? And what's the value of that to them? What would make them really excited about it? And if we think about the least amount that we can communicate to help them to feel ready to go, the price, like we say, is just a little something kind of at the end. In The Truth About Pricing, the new book, I have an example of grilled cheese sandwiches, which,
Mhm.
like a grilled cheese, even people that don't cook can probably make one of those, right? And we think, costs a dollar, maybe, like it's pretty cheap to make yourself a grilled cheese sandwich. And um, so if you think though, like what's the most you would ever pay for one? Like you're really excited, or you've like been craving this for a long time. Um, it's like some people would say maybe like, I don't know, if I was going bananas over it, maybe like $15 or 20, I guess, if I'm going really over the
Yeah.
edge. And there is a restaurant in New York City that has a $214 grilled cheese
Wow.
sandwich,
Mm.
and they sell them. They also have $200 French fries that they launched during the pandemic, to say they were like coming back. It was their big thing, and they have a lot of these Guinness World Record holders, but they did that, and those $200 French fries had an 8 to 10 week waiting list to be able to get them for $200 French fries. And again, the $214 grilled cheese. Most people don't order that, but it's not about that, right? So knowing they have a $214 grilled cheese makes it that if you're going to get one of their other sandwiches, like you're willing to pay $20 or $30 for it to be part of the experience of eating at this place. And you're going to take pictures and you're going to say, oh man, we were here and we did this at, Serendipity 3. And it's about something bigger.
Mm.
And it's not just about those grilled cheese, right? Because
Mm.
anybody could make a grilled cheese, but it's about the experience that comes with it. And then, I like to put in the example too of if anyone remembers the Virgin Mary grilled cheese that sold on eBay for, I think, $28,000. Um,
Okay. People bought it.
right. So, or, maybe it was 15,000. I'm mixing up my numbers. It's a lot. It's more than anyone should ever pay for a grilled cheese, especially one that was sitting on a dresser for a decade, but somebody did.
Wow. Wow. If you have money, you buy a sandwich worth 15,000 bucks.
That's gonna sit on display somewhere.
So I think I'm just going to conclude the overall podcast now. Do you have any tips for rising businesses with respect to behavioral economics? Something that they should start applying from now, if because something which is informed to everybody, but still they're not doing it on a regular basis. So probably 3 or 5 tips, whatever, that you would suggest that these are the must-haves for
Mm.
the business growth.
Well, what I always boil it down to is, so I end every episode of the Brainy Business by saying, be thoughtful. It's also my signature line, and it is intentional, right, with that. And to say that taking time to be more thoughtful in everything that you're doing is something that is the first step in being that curious questioner that I was talking about earlier, right? So it's about the generosity aspect, right? Be thoughtful to others. That's one side of it. It's also about being thoughtful in a way that you ask why you're doing something. I wonder why they did that thing. Why did I click on this email instead of this one? Why did I accept this LinkedIn request and that one I absolutely knew was spam immediately? And why was the cereal on this shelf? What if it had been on a different shelf? I wonder why did that happen that way? Why did I do that? Why'd they do that? Those sorts of questions can then help you to kind of learn a little bit more, like peek behind, the veil to the elephant for one, and to ask those deeper questions again that feel like behavior. And if something was different, why did I do this way this time? And going back to that LinkedIn message, right? We all get the emails and those LinkedIn requests that in a fraction of a second, you say spam, right? No, you're out. Want nothing to do with that. If you were to like cold send yourself
Mm.
the pitch emails and the LinkedIn requests that you are sending and you were able to like disassociate and read your own, do you think, would you feel like you're sending spam? Maybe.
Mm.
So that writer tends to think the way we want to be communicated to or what we would hate, it gets totally backwards all the time. And so no, too, like, it's just be a try being more genuine and not like jumping straight into that like marriage proposal sort of deal we are talking about, right? In the way that you communicate. So that thoughtfulness and um just asking those good questions are the top things that I would look at. And to give you a concept, because I know you want one, the framing is the first concept in what your customer wants and can't tell you. And it is first for a reason, because I think it is the easiest for people to start applying right away and one that can have most impact without having to have a lot of investment. So people that want to show that something worked to then go ask for some budget or something, you can look at how you're saying something instead of what you're saying. And I have 3 key reframes that I recommend looking at. So the first is if versus when. So we say if a lot. Like, if you're interested, let me know. If you have a question, I'm here. Like, if is like, maybe it'll happen, maybe not, probably not, I don't know, right? Whereas when has this implied it's going to happen and this is just the next step in the process, right? So when you're ready, here's the button to click. When you have questions, I'm here, right? Like that when is a very tiny shift. And it's not like you're never going to say if again, but it's to be more thoughtful when you see that when you go to write if, and now that I've said that, you're going to see you write it a lot. uh, that's a time to say, is there a way I could reframe this to be a win, to be that it's going to happen? The second one is going from anyone to everyone. So again, as a herding species, we like to feel safe, especially when we're looking to choose something that's different than what we've done before, when we're changing behavior, stepping out of that status quo. And anyone feels very isolating. Like, if anyone's interested, like, hello, are you interested? Anybody, right? Like, doesn't feel like a lot of people are doing that. So like when I have guests on my show, I'm talking about, their books or something. I don't say, if anybody wants so and so's book, like, there's a link in the show notes, right? I say, for everyone who is so excited to go get John's book, when you go into the show notes, there's a link waiting for you, right? Like, making everybody's doing it and you should too, right? So that little twist. And then the last one, which is something I talked about a little bit earlier, is going from a sentence to a question, and especially at the end, because we feel inclined to answer questions instead of leaving them open ended. So again, saying, if you, even when you have questions, I'm here. Like, okay, right. I'm not motivated to do anything.
That okay?
Yeah, cool, bye. Poop. Like, done. But if you instead say, you know, did I answer all your questions? Is there anything I didn't that I missed? Right? someone is inclined, like you want to keep the conversation going, and they may say, well, actually, I do have one more question, which is good. They may say, oh, no, you did a great job. You answered all my questions. That's also really good, right? Because you've now reinforced and them saying, like, no, you did a great job. Melina does a great job. Like, I like Melina. That's a good thing, right? And keeping that momentum is valuable. So getting that question at the end is much more likely to get a response than if you end on a statement. So those are my
Lovely.
three reframes,
If, not when. Not if, when.
right?
Not anyone,
Anyone,
everyone.
everyone,
Not
and
ending
then
with
go
a
from
period, ending with a question.
yes.
I hope the audience have taken a note. And with that, we come to the end of the podcast. Thank you so much, Melina. There was so much to talk about, and I think in the entire history of having these podcasts, we've never ever come so far. And even now, I feel that I need a part two for this. So
Right.
I think I might be reaching out to you soon. But I'm very very excited to read both of your books right now, and one more in January. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much for being here.
Thanks.